So Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte apparently just had their world completely turned upside down, and the way this whole thing played out in private is honestly so much more intense than anything the palace actually said publicly. The official statement was careful and polished and vague the way these things always are, but what was actually happening inside Windsor, while that statement was being drafted, is where the real story is. The timeline of who knew what, and when they knew it, is where things get genuinely complicated, because Catherine apparently made a decision that went directly against what some senior people wanted, and that choice is basically the reason the children broke down the way they did. Here is what happened. Catherine gathered Louis and Charlotte together in the family's private rooms at Windsor, and she told them herself, not through a statement, not through staff, not through some carefully managed family briefing, where someone else shapes the words to control the emotional reaction. She sat them down and told them directly that she would be stepping back indefinitely from public royal duties. And when I say indefinitely, I mean no clear return date, no fixed timeline, just an open-ended withdrawal from all the official appearances, charity visits, ceremonies, and public events that come with being a senior working royal. She also told them that their own upcoming appearances alongside her were canceled. So this wasn't just about her schedule changing. This was about their lives changing too. Now Charlotte apparently blinked like she'd misheard, which makes sense, right? Because Charlotte is old enough to understand what royal duties mean. She has been doing some appearances herself. She knows the rhythm of it. She knows when her mother is supposed to be at certain events. So hearing that all of that was stopping with no date for when it would start again, that is not a small adjustment. That a fundamental shift in how she understands her mother's role and her own place in the family's public life. Louis, being younger, apparently looked straight from Catherine to William, searching his father's face for some kind of answer that wasn't being said out loud, which is such a specific detail, because it tells you that even at his age, Louis could feel that something was being held back. Kids pick up on that energy immediately. They might not understand the details, but they absolutely know when adults are scared. William was there the whole time, but the silence was apparently crushing him, because here's the thing about William's position in this moment. He knew Catherine was trying to protect her health. He also knew she was trying to protect the children from what it feels like to be watched while you're afraid. Those are two different kinds of protection, and they were both happening at the same time. William, who grew up in the most public grief imaginable, knows exactly what it's like to be a child whose pain becomes a public spectacle. So watching his own children start to absorb this news, knowing the world was about to find out, that's a very specific kind of helplessness. Charlotte tried to hold it together. She sat up straighter, pressed her hands together, and asked if her mother would still come to family events, and that question right there tells you so much about how Charlotte's mind works. She wasn't asking about the public stuff. She was trying to figure out if her mother was going to disappear from the private moments too. She was drawing a line between duty and family, trying to understand which part she was losing. Catherine answered quickly, maybe too quickly, promising that love came before duty, and that was when Charlotte's voice cracked, not because she didn't believe her mother, but because she understood enough to know that something was seriously wrong. Not everything, but enough. Louis was the one who broke first. He moved toward Catherine and just clung to her, and apparently the force of it made William's face tighten, which honestly, that's the detail that gets me. Because William has been through so much publicly, and he's usually so controlled, but watching his youngest son desperately grab onto Catherine, like she might disappear, that's the kind of thing that cuts through any composure you build up. Louis didn't ask about statements or calendars or ceremonies. He asked if his mother was going away. That's it. That's the question. Catherine pulled him closer and told him no over and over, but the answer couldn't stop the tears, because here's the problem. She was telling him she wasn't going away, but she was also telling him she was stepping back from everything he associated with her public life. And for a child that young, those two things might feel like the same thing. Charlotte watched Louis fall apart, and the strength she'd been fighting to keep finally started to slip, and this is where the palace's worst fear became real. This was a controlled announcement with carefully managed emotions and prepared talking points. This was a family wound opening in real time with nothing between the children and the pain except their parents. No advisors, no filters, no media strategy. Just a mother trying to explain something devastating to two children who weren't ready to hear it. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting, because Catherine revealed something that made William look toward a side table. The announcement had originally been meant for senior aides later that day. The plan was to tell the staff who manage royal schedules and public messaging and official decisions before the world hears them. That's the normal process. The palace machine moves in a certain order, and the family usually follows that order, but Catherine refused. She refused to let the palace shape the words before her children heard them from her, and William apparently saw the sealed folder sitting near the lamp. The withdrawal papers Catherine had already signed, and his eyes changed. He knew in that moment that this was already done. She had made her decision, and she had made it alone before anyone else could weigh in. Charlotte followed William's gaze and saw the folder too, and this is where the shift happened from confusion to fear, because Charlotte is smart. She saw the sealed documents, and she understood that this wasn't a pause. This wasn't a canceled afternoon or rescheduled appearance. This was official. This was paperwork. This was real in a way that words alone couldn't convey. She turned to William and asked in a shaking voice whether things would ever be normal again, and William opened his mouth, but no easy answer came, because honestly, what do you say to that? You can't promise normal when you don't know what normal looks like anymore. The titles apparently disappeared in that room. There was no Princess of Wales, no future king, no line of succession. There was just a family trying not to fall apart. Catherine looked at Charlotte and Louis as a mother first, and that actually made the pain sharper because she knew her place in the crown mattered. She knew the institution depended on her calm strength, her public image, her ability to smile through pressure and face cameras and courtiers and ceremonies. She could even face a medical warning written in cold formal language, but she could not face the look in Charlotte's eyes when the child realized that adults had known before she did. That was the part that broke through everything else. William finally spoke, and apparently every word cost him something. He explained that he would continue many public duties alone, the official visits and royal appearances that show the family is still serving the country. He promised Charlotte and Louis that George would also be protected from too much attention, and this is where William's own childhood experience comes into play, because he understood a brutal truth that maybe other people in the palace didn't fully grasp. If the palace looked too calm, if they projected too much control, the children might be forced to carry the emotional weight in silence. William would not allow that, not after Louis had already asked if his mother was leaving them. He knew what it felt like to be a child of forming strength while falling apart inside, and he was not going to let that happen to his own kids. Charlotte's hurt turned quiet, which honestly made it worse. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse Catherine directly. She just asked what no one had told her earlier, and that question cut through the room. Catherine reached for her daughter, but Charlotte stayed still, fighting the feeling that she'd been treated like someone too young to understand pain, and that's such a specific kind of hurt. It's not about the news itself. It's about being excluded from the truth. It's about realizing that the adults around you made decisions about what you could handle without actually asking you. Charlotte wasn't just sad about her mother's health. She was hurt that she'd been kept in the dark. Louis moved closer to William, still frightened, still watching his mother as if one wrong breath might take her away from both royal life and family life at the same time, and Catherine confessed something in a low voice that I think explains a lot about how this whole situation unfolded. She had delayed this conversation for days. She had spoken to doctors. She had listened to advisors. She had faced courtiers, the trained palace staff who managed private schedules and public plans without breaking, but she could not face Charlotte's tears. That was a part she had hidden, not from the palace, but from herself. She knew this conversation was coming, and she kept putting it off because she couldn't bear to see her daughter cry, which is so deeply human, but also meant that by the time the conversation happened, the palace machinery was already moving, and the children were finding out after decisions had already been made. Then William revealed something through a private family conversation that added another layer. George had been told separately early that morning. The decision was made that George needed to hear it first, because his future role would pull him into questions the others might not yet understand, and I understand the logic there. George, as a future king, is at a different position. The questions that will come to him are different. The pressure is different, but Charlotte heard that and looked wounded all over again. Louis looked confused and scared because from their perspective, George got told first, which means there was a hierarchy to the truth. There was an order to who got to know, and Charlotte, who'd been trying so hard to be brave and mature, suddenly felt like she'd been treated as less capable of handling difficult information than her older brother. Catherine saw both reactions and knew the truth hadn't healed them yet. It had only opened the door. William stepped out to call King Charles, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than his words. Catherine stayed with Charlotte and Louis, trying to hold the room together with nothing but love, and then Charlotte whispered the sentence that everyone had been afraid of. She asked if this happened because of them, if her mother's health crisis was somehow caused by the children, and Catherine froze. Louis turned toward his sister, and that single sentence pulled the whole family backward into the hidden moment that actually started everything. Because here's what the public didn't know. The tragedy didn't begin with the announcement. It began weeks earlier at a private Windsor rehearsal. It was supposed to be a simple preparation for a children's charity ceremony. Catherine had smiled through the morning. Charlotte had practiced her curtsy. Louis had joked beside William. Everything was normal. Then one small moment changed everything. Catherine had been helping Charlotte prepare a short reading when her strength suddenly failed. This was for the Windsor Children's Patronage Ceremony, a family-focused royal event connected to charities supported by the Monarchy for children and young people. Catherine's presence mattered deeply for this event because her role gave warmth to the ceremony, and Charlotte's small part was meant to show quiet continuity inside the family. Instead, the moment became the trigger no one could forget. Charlotte saw her mother's face change before any aide could step in. Louis stopped joking. William moved fast, steadying Catherine before fear could fully take over. He tried to keep his voice calm, but the prince knew the children had seen too much. Catherine smiled at Charlotte and Louis, telling them she was fine, but Charlotte knew the smile was forced. Louis kept staring at William because he had heard the urgent whisper to the medical advisor, and that whisper mattered because it told Louis this wasn't tiredness. It wasn't a small pause. It was something adults were trying to hide. Catherine later faced William in private, and they apparently had an argument that cut deep because both of them were right. She wanted to keep serving. He wanted her safe. She believed stepping back would frighten the children even more, but William insisted the opposite was true. Every appearance, every ceremony, every forced smile would now carry risk. He told her that public duty could not come at the price of Charlotte watching her mother weaken again, or Louis wondering whether royal life was taking her away piece by piece. A senior doctor then put the warning in writing. The documented account advised a full and indefinite withdrawal from demanding royal appearances, meaning no clear return date and no heavy public schedule until Catherine's health could truly bear it. That paper changed everything. Catherine asked that the warning remain sealed until she personally told Charlotte, Louis, and George she could accept palace planning. She could accept medical limits, but she would not allow her children to learn the truth through a briefing, a leak, or a carefully shaped message crafted by communication staff. Here is where the timeline gets complicated. King Charles learned the document existed before Catherine was ready for the palace machine to move, and the moment the monarch knew, control began to slip from Catherine's hands. The king understood at once that this was no longer only a private family pain. It touched the public face of the crown, the duties of William, and emotional safety of 3 children growing up under impossible attention. Once the monarch knew, the private pain had reached the throne. By the time William entered the king's private study, grief had hardened into protection. Charles sat behind the desk with the sealed medical file before him, but William didn't wait for permission to speak. He placed both hands on the chair in front of him and made one thing clear. Catherine was not a symbol to be managed. She was his wife, and her children had already suffered enough. William spoke first because silence had already done too much damage. He told Charles that Catherine's withdrawal had to be handled as a family wound before it became a palace problem. The king listened without interrupting, but he understood the pressure pressing in from every side. Catherine's absence would affect public schedules, charity visits, ceremonial duties, and patronages, which are the causes or organizations or royal supports to bring attention and trust. Her step back mattered because she was not only loved by the public, she had become a steady part of the monarchy's image of calm care and future strength. Charles looked at the sealed file and felt the weight of the crown in a way no speech could soften. The king knew the institution needed stability because the public watches royal absences for signs of weakness, fear, or hidden crisis. But he also knew he was not only speaking as monarch. He was hearing as a grandfather that Louis had broken down and Charlotte had asked if she had caused her mother's pain. That detail changed the room. It made every official plan feel colder. William refused to let Charlotte and Louis become tools for public comfort. He said the children would not be pushed into appearances to make the family look strong, and they would not stand beside cameras simply to cover Catherine's empty place. He reminded Charles that George had already been told separately and that all three children now needed protection from pressure being symbols before they were ready. William's voice stayed controlled, but anger sat beneath every word. Then Charles revealed something that made William's face change according to a private recorded family briefing prepared for the household archive. Some senior advisors had wanted a carefully worded public statement released before the children were told. Let that sink in. There were people inside the palace system who thought the public should know before Charlotte and Louis heard it from their own mother. William could accept pressure. He could accept duty, but he could not accept the palace message reaching the world before Catherine's own voice reached her children. For one sharp moment, the room stopped feeling like a study and started feeling like a battlefield. William answered without raising his voice. He slid Catherine's signed withdrawal paper across the desk and let the decision speak for itself. The document was simple but devastating. She had already stepped back, and the palace no longer had the right to shape the truth before the family did. Charles read it, set it down, and finally agreed that Charlotte Louis and George would be shielded from public use. But the agreement didn't end the danger. It only exposed a new one. Someone inside the palace would see Catherine's absence not as a heartbreak, but as an opening. Charles knew it. William knew it. And where there's a vacuum inside the monarchy, someone always tries to fill it. Outwardly, the palace prepared words of sympathy. Behind the doors, power began moving like a shadow across old carpets and private desks. Catherine's withdrawal was not only a family heartbreak. It changed who appeared, who represented, who influenced, and who stood closest to the throne. As Charlotte cried upstairs and Louis refused dinner, adults downstairs began deciding what their mother's absence would mean. William sensed the danger before anyone said it plainly. He knew Catherine's patronages, the charities and causes she publicly supported, were more than names on a schedule. They connected her to families, children, hospitals, and people who saw her as a source of comfort. Palace officials began reviewing those patronages along with planned appearances and ceremonial responsibilities because an indefinite step back left empty spaces. A monarchy could not ignore, and empty spaces inside the royal system do not stay empty for long. Queen Camilla listened as aides discussed calm language and possible duty changes, but her unease grew with every careful sentence. She understood the palace needed to look steady. She also understood that moving too fast would look cold. Catherine was still upstairs with children who had just watched their world shift, and yet downstairs people were already speaking of redistribution. Camilla did not like the speed of it. Still, she did not stop the conversation, and that silence carried its own weight. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, stepped in quietly, but her words landed harder than any raised voice. She warned William that Charlotte and Louis would remember this moment forever, not because of the public statement, but because of how the adults behaved after tears. Sophie knew children carried emotional details differently from adults. They might forget the exact words. They would not forget whether their mother was protected or replaced. William heard that and hardened. He would not let Catherine's absence become someone else's opening. Then the draft appeared. A proposal written as a private administrative note suggested moving several family-facing patronages away from Catherine immediately. The document claimed it would prevent confusion, but William saw something else. He saw haste. He saw control dressed up as concern. He saw the first sign that Catherine's pain could be used to rearrange influence around her before the family had even found its breath. The prince pushed the paper back and said no decision would be made over his wife's head. Charles read the same proposal alone later, and the king's face changed. He knew the monarchy depended on order, because public trust often rests on the belief that someone is always ready to carry the duty. But he also knew Catherine had earned loyalty that could not be handed over like a place card. The monarch set the proposal down without signing it. Then he said her name softly, as if reminding the room that she was not a vacancy. Charles refused to rush the transfer, and for one brief moment compassion, held back control. But the refusal didn't heal the split. It exposed it. One side wanted patience. The other wanted movement. And that split would become impossible to hide once the first consequences reached the children. The first fallout didn't come from a newspaper or a palace statement. It came from a simple change on the family calendar. A name was crossed out. A carriage appearance was removed. A children's charity visit was canceled. Charlotte saw it before anyone could explain. Louis saw his sister's face fall, and suddenly Catherine's announcement became real in the cruelest possible way. Charlotte stood frozen over the revised schedule, and one missing name told her everything. The Windsor Children's Patronage Ceremony was the same event that had once felt like a proud family moment. Now the schedule confirmed that Catherine, Charlotte, and Louis would no longer attend together. For Charlotte, that ceremony had been a small promise that she could stand beside her mother and learn courage from her. For Louis, it had meant normal life would continue. William saw the paper too late. He ordered staff to stop leaving revised documents where the children could find them, because in royal life a family schedule is more than a timetable. It shows who will appear, who will step back, and how the palace wants the public to understand change. William knew that if Charlotte and Louis learned the truth through crossed-out names, they would feel managed instead of loved. But the damage had already landed. Charlotte didn't cry at first, and that silence frightened Catherine more than tears would have. She stepped away from the table, her face tight with hurt, carrying the quiet pain of a child who had been proud of a duty now taken from her. Catherine reached for her, but Charlotte looked at the schedule again, as if the missing name might return if she stared long enough. Her mother understood then that the announcement had not ended the pain. It had only begun its second wave. Louis reacted differently. He shoved a chair back with sudden anger and asked why royal rules mattered if they made everyone sad. William moved toward him, but the boy was not really angry at his father. He was angry at the coldness of it all. A ceremony could disappear. A name could be removed. A family moment could be changed by ink, paper, and quiet decisions made outside the room. Louis wanted someone to say it was wrong, and for a second no one knew how to answer him. Catherine later admitted to William that this was the exact moment she had feared. She had worried Charlotte and Louis would discover the consequences piece by piece instead of hearing them through love. William listened and made his decision. No more documents first. No more schedules first. No more whispers before truth. From that moment, the family would speak before the palace moved. Catherine accepted that promise, but one wound still waited in silence. Charlotte had not only lost the ceremony, she had lost the feeling that she understood her mother's world. So Catherine chose to speak to her daughter alone, away from advisors, away from duty, away from every royal expectation. For the first time since the announcement, mother and daughter would face the truth without anyone standing between them. There were no courtiers in the room, no schedules, no polished statements, just Catherine and Charlotte sitting close enough to hear each other breathe. The young princess had tried to be brave for too long, but bravery finally gave way to the question beneath every tear. She asked if her mother had stepped back because the children had become too much to carry. Catherine reached for Charlotte before the silence could grow cruel. She had chosen this private mother-daughter moment over another family briefing, because a briefing is a managed conversation where words are shaped to control fear before anyone speaks from the heart. Catherine knew Charlotte did not need careful palace language. She needed her mother. Charlotte had been standing between two worlds, old enough to feel the weight of royal duty, but still young enough to believe she might have caused the pain around her. Charlotte finally revealed the fear she had been hiding in a recorded private family account later, kept for William. She admitted that she thought the rehearsal incident was partly her fault because Catherine had been helping her with the reading when her strength failed. The words came out slowly, as if saying them made them more dangerous. Charlotte remembered her mother's face changing. She remembered Louis freezing. She remembered William moving quickly, and in her young mind the timing had turned into blame. Catherine took Charlotte's hands and stopped that thought before it could bury itself any deeper. She told her plainly that no child caused this decision, no reading, no ceremony, no mistake, no moment of fear. She explained that royal duty meant the public work expected from the family, but no duty mattered more than love, health, and truth inside their home. Charlotte listened, but the pain did not leave her at once. It broke open first. Charlotte finally cried without trying to hide it. Catherine did not tell her to be strong. She did not ask her to stand tall or remember who she was. She simply let her daughter fall apart, because sometimes love does not fix pain quickly. Sometimes love stays close while pain speaks. The young princess had carried bravery like a shield, and now the shield was gone. Catherine held her and made the promise Charlotte needed most. She might step back from the balcony ceremonies and public duties, but never from being her mother. Louis appeared at the doorway before either of them expected it. He had heard enough to understand the part that mattered, and Catherine did not send him away. She opened her arms and Louis went straight to her. Still scared, but no longer alone in that fear. Charlotte wiped her face and moved closer to him. For the first time since the announcement, the children were not being protected by silence. They were being protected by truth. William found them together and stopped before speaking. He saw Catherine holding Charlotte and Louis, and he understood what the palace had nearly missed. This was not damage control. Damage control meant try to protect an image after something painful had happened. This was something deeper. This was emotional truth. The future king knew the family could no longer let papers, aides, or public pressure decide the order of pain. Catherine looked at William, and he gave the smallest nod. Charlotte stayed close to her mother. Louis held on tighter. Nothing had become easy, but something had shifted. The family had stopped pretending that royal strength meant silence. But outside Windsor, the world was already turning Catherine's private heartbreak into a public storm. By morning, the private announcement had become the only story anyone wanted to discuss. The palace statement was careful, but the public reaction was not. People didn't focus on protocol. They focused on the children. Charlotte's composure, Louis's heartbreak, Catherine's absence, and across Britain one image took hold, a mother forced to step back and two young royals learning too early what duty can cost. William moved before the story could become cruel. He asked that Charlotte and Louis be protected from public pressure, and his request carried the force of a father who had watched both children break in different ways. The palace statement confirmed Catherine's indefinite withdrawal from public duties and the cancellation of the children's planned appearances beside her. The public had not simply lost a royal face from the calendar. They had witnessed a family choosing health over performance. Catherine stayed away from a noise, but her absence spoke louder than any speech. Parents across the country understood the choice in a deeply personal way. They saw a mother refusing to let duty swallow her children's peace. They saw Charlotte trying to stay brave. They saw Louis react with the honesty only a child can carry. The sympathy grew quickly because the story was not about status anymore. It was about fear, love, and the painful cost of being watched while hurting. Camilla watched the coverage in silence, and the queen consort understood something the palace could not easily solve. Catherine's emotional place in the public imagination could not be replaced by another schedule, another appearance, or another carefully worded line. The monarchy can move duties around, but it cannot move affection so easily. Camilla knew the institution needed calm, yet she also knew calm without warmth would look empty. If the palace handled this coldly, the public would feel it. Then came the front page that changed the tone of the morning. One newspaper placed a soft image of Windsor gates beneath the headline, "A Mother Before the Crown." The phrase cut through every official sentence. It gave the public a simple truth to hold. Catherine had not abandoned duty. She had chosen the one duty no palace could outrank. William saw the headline and said nothing, but the prince knew it had already done what no statement could do. It had defined the moment. Outside Kensington Palace, people began arriving. The flowers and handwritten cards for Charlotte and Louis. Kensington Palace is a royal residence closely linked with William and Catherine's family life, so the gathering felt personal, not political. Some cards were addressed to Catherine. Others were written directly to the children with simple messages telling them they were loved and not alone. Private grief had become national feeling, and the palace could no longer pretend this was only an internal matter. King Charles absorbed the reaction with the silence of a man measuring history. The king understood the crown had tried to manage the moment, but the people had already decided what it meant. Catherine was not being judged for stepping back. She was being embraced for protecting her family, and as the flowers gathered and the headlines hardened into memory, Charles prepared one final decision. In the end, Catherine's announcement was not remembered as weakness. It was remembered as the moment a future queen chose truth over performance. Charlotte and Louis broke down because they understood what the palace sometimes forgets. Duty can wound the innocent when silence becomes too heavy. But from that pain came a decision that no protocol could erase. Charles made the final decision with the weight of a grandfather and the duty of a king. He formally approved Catherine's indefinite withdrawal without redistributing her most personal family-focused patronages. That choice mattered because removing those causes too quickly would have made Catherine look replaced instead of protected. The monarch understood the difference. He preserved her place, and by doing so, he sent a quiet message to the palace. This was not a vacancy. This was a mother being given room to heal. William confirmed the second part privately, and the prince did not leave space for argument. Charlotte, Louis, and George would not be pushed into symbolic appearances to cover their mother's absence. Symbolic appearances are public moments used to send a message, often meant to show strength or unity even when private life is painful. William knew those moments could comfort the public, but he also knew they could wound the children. He had seen Louis cling to Catherine. He had heard Charlotte ask if she was to blame. He would not let the crown use their brave faces as a shield. Catherine felt the sorrow of stepping back, but she also felt relief. For days, she had feared the children's reaction more than any public storm. Now Charlotte and Louis knew the truth from her own voice, not from a leaked paper, a changed schedule, or a polished palace statement. Catherine had lost a part of her public life, but she had protected something far more precious inside her family. She had chosen honesty before image, and that choice changed the emotional meaning of everything. Charlotte slowly accepted that her mother's choice was not abandonment. Louis began to understand it in his own way, too. Catherine was not leaving them. She was stepping away before royal pressure took more from her than she could safely give. The sealed medical warning remained private, and that privacy mattered because not every pain belongs to the public. But the emotional truth became impossible to hide. Catherine had chosen survival motherhood, and honesty over the crushing demand to perform strength. William's quiet stand changed the tone inside the palace. The prince had not shouted for power. He had not turned the moment into a public battle. He had simply refused to sacrifice his children for appearances, and that refusal pointed toward a different kind of reign. Charles saw it. Catherine felt. Charlotte and Louis lived it. The next chapter of the monarchy would not be judged only by ceremony, titles, or tradition. It would be judged by whether the family remembered its own humanity. This moment forced the monarchy to become more human. Catherine's tragic announcement broke Charlotte and Louis for one painful day, but it also protected them for the years ahead. It proved that love could stand above protocol, that truth could be kindled in silence, and that a mother's first duty was not to the balcony, the calendar, or the crown. It was to the children holding her hand, and that is why this was not only the day Catherine stepped back. It was the day her family stepped forward around her.